This is Breakpoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Welcome to another edition of Breakpoint This Week. I'm Shane Morris, here with John Stonestreet to explore the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And John, the top story of this week was unquestionably the call going up nationwide in the wake of protests and riots to defund the police, or even to abolish the police, as some have it.
Well, yeah, it's a heck of a way to begin by saying it's the unquestioned story of the week, because there was a lot of stories this week.
There were a lot of stories.
A lot of them that continue from previous weeks. Even as we record this, the day we record this here on Thursday, lots of reports of coronavirus spikes again. It desperately impacted the market on Thursday. It dropped about, I think, 1,700 points, one of the largest drops. One-day drops. And there's a lot going on, and yet this is really a fascinating development. What started as protest with mantra, "I can't breathe," which was, of course, the last words of George Floyd to the people who killed him, now has turned into a cry of defund the police or abolish the police. That's a major shift.
The Minneapolis Police Department, where this is sort of the epicenter of the whole thing, actually pledged on Sunday to dismantle their police department, promising a whole new system.
Right, and then in Seattle, you actually had police forces standing down as a left-leaning force kind of takes over downtown, right? And
we'll talk about Chaz in a minute.
Well, you might have to introduce that. I mean, so it's interesting because I think this falls into the category of when somebody says defund the police, the first thing we have to ask is, well, what do you mean by that? I mean, do you mean what the Minnesota or the Minneapolis City Council meant, and especially the spokesperson who, answered a question this week by saying the ability to call the police is a white privilege? Is that what we mean, or do we mean what happened in New Jersey, right? What's the town in New Jersey? Canton, New Jersey, right? Where they essentially didn't defund in sense of abolish, but they basically took out the structure that was there and replaced it with a better structure. And we've seen remarkable police reform in cities around the country. Maybe not necessarily as dramatic as all that, but a difference. And some people, that's what they mean by defund is, defund this aspect or defund this aspect to demilitarize. Or, does it mean what we saw in Seattle, which is a developing story? And I don't even know what to say about it, other than it just seems to get kind of crazier and crazier there. And government officials who have allowed kind of that lawlessness to have a presence for a while seem, pretty powerless or unwilling to do anything about that.
Yeah, the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone. I'm just expecting the guillotines to show up, Madame la Guillotine to show up any second now.
Well, you want to start singing Les Mis songs, but this isn't exactly the same thing. And tell people about that, though, because I don't know if everyone knows. Maybe by now they do, but this is bizarre and troubling.
Seattle, Washington, protesters have cordoned off this area around Capitol Hill with barricades and are calling it the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, or CHAZ for short. And they say they plan to stay until this list of demands are met, including defunding and abolishing the police department. And by that, they really mean it literally. They're not using it as sort of code for something else. There are paramilitary checkpoints with self-appointed guards with, AR-15s that block the entry to anywhere around Capitol Hill there, and they've got barricades. So it really looks very French Revolution.
I think they're collecting taxes.
They're extorting the local businesses, right? Yeah.
I mean, you can't make this up. This is like what who was that, Papa Doc in Port-au-Prince, Haiti? There are plenty of people trying to assure everyone it's not that bad, and the media is losing their mind over something that's not credible. But the point is, the media is not losing their mind, because the media is not even talking about this. This is a conversation happening on Twitter, the new media by and large. It's just a strange sort of development. But look, I think we need to get at the heart of this, because the gut level conservative reaction is going to be to respond, with an unqualified support of the police. And those who have brought our attention to issues of police brutality, not just against African Americans, but even in general, but especially against African Americans, are going to say, well, I don't mean what's happening in Seattle, but something needs to change. And I tell you what it made me think of this week, Shane, is Chuck Colson. A lot of things make me think of Chuck Colson. I have a bracelet, WWCD, what would Chuck do? Or maybe what would Chuck say? But he thought about these things in terms of prison reform, right? The narrative when he emerged was Are you going to be tough on crime or are you going to be soft on crime? And he said, you know what, there's a third way. That's the narrative now when it comes to policing. And the idea that a society doesn't need a police force or some sort of check is a utopian fantasy. There's not a singular community in the history of the world that is without the fall, that doesn't need some sort of accountability that way. Now, have we seen throughout history some societies more morally able to govern themselves so that policing, changed dramatically or shrunk? This is one of the major things that happened out of Wilberforce's reforms in pre-Victorian England, is that the police force shrunk. And this was
is necessary. Yeah, the conscience or the constable. I don't know who coined the phrase, but it's one we use a lot.
Well, it is, but that's a remarkable thing because, pre-Victorian England was a terrible place to live. But see, what happened wasn't a reform in policing, although that was like a fruit, not a root. The root was a reformation of virtue. And so when we start talking about things like abolishing police or at least dramatically reducing police, the question has to be, well, are we able to govern ourselves? And I think the obvious answer to that is no. That doesn't mean, however, that there's not a good bit of reform. And that's what, Chuck Colson said. Here you have a group of people in prisons who deserve to be in prisons because of things that they had done. And yet there were ways that they were being treated harshly. There were things that were being allowed to go on. There was abuse that was being allowed. And he said, there's a third way. And I think that this is a very important conversation, and there is a clear third way that needs to be pursued, or maybe a number of third ways, depending on the health and well-being of a community, that needs to be pursued.
Yeah, that was one of the first things that struck me about Chuck coming on with the Colson Center. It was actually before it was called the Colson Center, was that he was sort of the conscience of the law and order right. Where, it wasn't just a lock them up and throw away the key mentality. There was a call for prison reform coming out of Prison Fellowship and Chuck's work. He always quoted this statistic where, he said, when I got out of prison after Watergate, there was the X amount of prisoners. And it was some very small number compared to what it is. And he said,
it was 250,000 to 2 million
right,
was the jump.
Now it's now it's 3.5 million, something in that range is what he used to quote. And that was the basis for his call for reform in the prison system. And prison reform goes hand in hand with reform in policing. And that's a very conservative thing to call for. I think we need to be really, really careful, despite the terrible choice of slogan here for this movement to abolish the police or defund the police. Well, nobody, I don't think anyone who's serious wants to, or rather intellectually credible, wants to abolish the police. But this phrase is standing in for a lot of valid calls for police reform. David French, for instance, conservative writer, brought up several great ideas like abolishing civil asset forfeiture and qualified immunity and all kinds of other abuses that lead to not only over-incarceration, but the kind of potentially systemic racism problems that we're seeing in the police forces. And I think this is a very pro-police thing to do, right? It's straightening out the system, making it more efficient, making it more just. It'll improve the reputation and the job performance of police around the country. So, yeah, I love what a colleague of ours said today, or earlier this week in a meeting that we had, John. He said that first thing we need to do is denounce the phrase abolish the police or defund the police, because that's not what we're after, and we should be very precise in our messaging.
That's a nonsensical phrase, yeah. But that doesn't mean that there's not changes that can be made and should be made for the good of everyone. And this is something I think that folks can lead on. I want to spend just a moment on one of those suggestions, and that has to do with qualified immunity. We have a number of institutions across America that enjoy qualified immunity. So our producer, Steve Ryder, we talked about him a couple weeks ago, just having lost his wife and not being able to see her because of rules that the hospital had that were not keeping up to date with the reality on the ground of COVID-19. And what he's found out since is that the hospital she's in, because it's a teaching hospital, has qualified immunity. So even though that he was done wrong.
Explain for our listeners what that means.
Well, it just means you can't get in trouble for doing something wrong.
For something your boss told you to do. Right, as long as it's according to policy, you can't get in trouble for discretionary moves. Yeah,
but it's such a squishy category, right? There's a good bit of discretion involved, and this is what we're seeing with the police. So the police are able to, there's videos popping up. I was watching a video right now earlier today, and a guy gets pulled over going 60 and a 50, and the cop threatens to pull him out of the car and pepper spray him, and this guy's staying calm. and videotaping the whole thing, but going, do you realize what's happening? And the guy goes, well, I can do that because I can remove anybody from their car for any reason. So here you have this policy that is so big you can drive a Mack truck through it, right? And so loose and so porous that you can justify any decision, and that's the problem. But the deeper problem is that it treats an entity or an individual as if they don't need to be accountable or responsible to anyone. And no one should live unaccountable and not responsible to someone. Do I need to bring up the TSA again? Do I need to bring that up? Because they're an example of qualified immunity.
I have a little timer, and I know by a certain point in each episode you will bring up the TSA.
Well, I think it makes actually my point. But the police enjoy a level of qualified immunity that, for example, that makes them unaccountable. Now, look, no one is saying here that the vast majority of policemen are bad people trying to do bad things. No one is saying here that they're not under an incredible amount of pressure, increasingly in certain communities where there's high levels of crime. And there's all kinds of these things to bring into it. But that doesn't mean like improvement can't be made. And so the best way, I think, to defend public safety is to have a virtuous citizenry. You can't ever do it without that. You can have the most militarized police that you want, and you're not going to protect citizens if the citizens themselves aren't virtuous. At the same time, a militarized police, what I'm hearing today is that some public officials are saying that's what we need to do, is we need these police to come in and knock heads and that sort of stuff. Look, if you are in a community in which that's the solution to your problem, you haven't solved the problem. You've just revealed how bad the problem is, right? In other words, that's not a long-term sustainable thing.
Yeah, there shouldn't be an us versus them mentality in the police to begin with. That's really unhealthy and toxic.
No, that's right. And you know this because the public officials that you know that are there to serve and protect, when you meet them, you know, and you see what they're trying to do. And you know what? For as many videos as there are of cops, abusing their authority, there's wonderful videos of cops doing wonderful things as well. This stuff can be made systemic at some level. And part of that is, at least in the George Floyd case, is you got to take care when a cop has 16 complaints against him that goes back, this qualified immunity means he doesn't get in trouble. And that's one of the reasons that has to go.
We got to take a quick break here. We'll be right back after this to talk more about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. Stay with us.
We invite you to visit Breakpoint.org, and while you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of books and other resources, and you can find links to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
We're back on Breakpoint this week. Shane Morris here with John Stonestreet talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And John, two of the other stories that were obviously tied with this, we mentioned the Chaz thing in Seattle, but we've also got this ongoing issue of systemic racism and white privilege. And we get a lot of questions here about this particular issue. To what extent is critical race theory, white privilege, are these concepts that Christians can, interact with? Can we appropriate these and harmonize them with a Christian way of thinking about the world? And I think it's a really good question, and we should have a discussion about that, because this is the real complaint, right? It's not George Floyd and other instances of police brutality and injustice. Those aren't those are the focal points, but the larger issue is this complaint that the police as a whole and the justice system as a whole are subject to injustices. So let's talk about white privilege, critical race theory. How do Christians deal with this stuff?
Yeah, and let's do it as two white guys, right? I mean, what could go wrong? No, it's an important question. And I think even the phrase critical race theory needs, first of all, everything needs to be defined. That's one of the first things that we say, is that worldviews get smuggled in through definitions.
It's a question. What do you mean by that?
What do you mean by that? I'm telling you, it's the most useful question that you can have. And even the fact that we're talking about critical race theory, and I would suggest before we look at critical race theory, we look at critical theory. Because critical race theory is specifically looking and trying to apply critical theory in the area of race. But critical theory itself and intersectionality and all the things that go along with it are actually ideas that basically take any perceived oppressed minority class and gives that group moral authority simply on the case that they are oppressed, and the oppressors, and what that means is not somebody that is currently oppressing, but someone that is part of a class that has historically oppressed the oppressors. They lose moral authority. And intersectionality comes because we all belong to a multiple, set of groups, right? So I might be, for example, white, but I might be female, and that changes, the power balance. There's two power balances there that have to be considered. Or maybe I'm, a sexual minority. an LGBT, or maybe impoverished as opposed to upper class. And so there's just a number of these factors, and essentially you try to weigh them out, and that's really what critical theory. First thing I want to say is we have got a set of What Would You Say videos, new series that we've done that deal with these two questions. And as folks come to breakpoint.org, we'll link to it there at the show notes. Now, I'm going to give a punchline right off the bat, Shane, and we can kick it back and forth. The punchline is critical theory in and of itself is incompatible with the Christian worldview on a number of levels, and we can talk about what those levels are. On the flip side, I do think we're struggling right now because just because we say critical theory itself is illegitimate as a tool, as a way of seeing the world, certainly as a theory of everything, which it's quickly becoming is the way you see literally everything.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that things like racism and even systemic racism, although it may not mean everything that critical race theorists mean, that systemic racism doesn't exist. And I think we've got a problem in which people are using critical theory, including Christians, to try to see the world, and it's incompatible at heart with a Christian worldview. On the flip side, people are finding critical theory under every rock. You know, it's now the boogeyman that's keeping us from actually identifying problems that do actually exist. And they don't exist because critical theory. They exist because we're fallen human beings, and there's a whole layer of both individual and systemic consequences of sin because of that. And that's kind of the line that I felt like last week Chris Brooks and Andy Crouch helped us walk through, talking about the difference, for example, Chris did, between the phrase Black Lives Matter and the group Black Lives Matter.
The organization, right. Yeah.
And talking about what critical theory gets wrong. And then the personal experience and the cultural realities of racism that our friend Pastor Chris Brooks sees, far too clearly. We can do both.
Yeah, and we can do both precisely because bad theories often begin with real injustices. Like they notice real things about the world that need to be dealt with. And the evidence for things like systemic racism is real, that there is racism in the world, in our country in particular, and in our history, and that continues to plague us. And you look at the individual stories and experience of Black Americans, that's worth listening to. We should be listening to that and acknowledging what's going on there. And that's something that Pastor Brooks was very good on. Another pastor friend of mine actually on Facebook posted about this whole issue and how we as Christians can think about it. And he noted that white Americans are often too eager to declare premature victory over America's racist past, that this is just something we can, kind of sweep under the rug and put behind us. But so many of our Black brothers and sisters are saying, no, it's something that still affects us. We have to continue to deal with it. On the other hand, when we're talking about critical theory as it's applied to race, we can see it eating itself in real time. There was this great Quillette article that we sent around in our editorial team about a critical race professor or a critical theory professor who specialized in this thing called securitization, which it's complicated to explain. But he was excoriated by other critical race theorists they claimed that his particular brand of critical theory had racist underpinnings and assumptions. And so it's just like a snake eating its own tail kind of thing. And I think it comes down to, John, the reason it does that, it's abolition of man, is where C.S. Lewis says this. We have to bring in C.S. Lewis and the TSA in every episode. That's just our tradition.
It's the rule.
Right. But he says that, it's nice to see through things culturally, but you can't go on seeing through everything forever, because at some point, if you see through everything, you're blind. The point of seeing through something is to see something solid on the other side, something opaque, right? And if you continue to look through every cultural fact as a power dynamic, as a manifestation of some group trying to gain power over the other, well, pretty soon you end up in postmodern la-la land where you can't even use language anymore. Was it Derrida who said that you can't even really know that I meant what I said in my book? Or something to that effect.
Oh, no, it's a much better story about Derrida, where, he said there's nothing but interpretation. And then when he put his book out in a scholarly sense, people took it apart. And he basically said, wait a minute, you misinterpreted me. And, this stuff, you can't stand. Critical theory, and let's look at these things just quickly, critical theory and then white privilege, because I'm going to point to a couple different, hopefully helpful sources on both. Critical theory notes that there is a problem. It is a tool for what's wrong. What it's not is a tool for building anything. So that's the first thing you need to know about critical theory, is that it just basically points out what's wrong. It doesn't have any constructive ability whatsoever. Secondly, even though it's a tool for analysis, I don't think it's actually even a good tool or the best tool, mainly because it gets the human condition wrong. And what I mean is critical theory draws the line between oppressor and oppressed and says everybody on this side of the line is good and everybody on that side of the line is bad, or vice versa.
It does so in very simplistic ways, too. Like another a theologian I follow on Facebook pointed out this week, his name's Alistair Roberts, great guy. He said that critical race theory completely steamrolls over the fact that there are whole groups of so-called white people who had nothing whatsoever to do with the oppression of Africans, especially African Americans. So, you can't say this, okay, here are the Swedes. What kind of white privilege do they have? Well, that steamrolls over those realities and completely ignores them. So it's too simplistic in that way.
Yeah, that's right. And because that's used, and this phrase white privilege really comes out of that, I thought Glenn Sunshine, who's been a longtime associate of the Colson Center, he does a fun podcast called the Theology Pugcast. And they talked about this. And Glenn made a really great point about this. He said, there's no question that whites enjoy a set of conditions that put them in advantaged positions in culture, right? And you can't always make it just about whether it's white or black. Sometimes it's socioeconomic or something like that. But certain people do have a step up, right? Sometimes that's the result of moral choices. Sometimes it really does reveal that there's systemic problems. For example, I've never ever thought that I'm going to get pulled over, 2 blocks from my house asking me, are you sure you live in this neighborhood and did you steal that car? I have too many African American friends who have said that's their story to know that it actually doesn't happen. Do I think it happens in every neighborhood? Do I think it happens 100% of the time? No, but if it happens 10% of the time, it happens way more than I would ever imagine, right?
Yeah, and the fact that for you and me, the police are basically pulling us over. It's an annoying experience. It's not something that we're afraid of.
That's right. It's not going to escalate. I mean, there's all kinds of things. What Glenn pointed out is that there are conditions that give people steps up in the sense that you might call it privilege. So the problem with the way we're looking at this is that we're kind of focusing on white privilege as if it's the problem, right? And the problem isn't in that situation that we just described that you and I don't get treated that way. The problem is that African Americans do get treated that way. Right. And when we lock in on, you need to apologize for this, no, that's missing the whole injustice. The injustice is being done against those who are being treated wrongly. And that's the problem we should solve. And this, in a sense, gets at the heart of what's wrong with critical theory. It defines the human condition wrong, and it defines the human problem wrong, misses the fall, and therefore it's going to mess up on the solution. And again, we go over that in a wonderful What Would You Say video that we have at the Colson Center. You can go to whatwouldyousay.org, or we'll link to it in the show notes here at breakpoint.org.
Okay, we're going to take another break here. We'll be right back after this to talk about another story of this week from a Christian worldview perspective. Stay with us.
You can learn more about Breakpoint and the Colson Center for Christian Worldview when you visit breakpoint.org. That's breakpoint.org.
We're back on Breakpoint this week, talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview perspective. And John, another story this week that really caught my attention, one that I've been following.
I call these stories the "you ain't woke enough" stories.
You ain't woke enough.
You
stories.
ain't woke enough.
Okay,
stories.
so J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter series,
feminist.
Feminist, down the roster liberal in just about every way you can think of, has offended the woke police and is now being subject to a really renewed effort to cancel her. But the thing is, J.K. Rowling is kind of too big to cancel. So in a series of tweets, she mocked trans-inclusive terminology like people who menstruate, saying there used to be a word for those. And then she kind of played around and said, well, it's a, wombin or wimbin or something like that. And despite the online backlash from prior so-called transphobic tweets, she's actually doubled down, and she actually wrote an essay a couple days ago on her website insisting that woman is not, quote, an idea in a man's head, and that trans-inclusive language is, quote, dehumanizing and demeaning to women. She actually continued, and this is just the money line, when you throw open the doors of bathrooms and changing rooms to any man who believes or feels he's a woman, then you open the door to any and all men who wish to come inside. She also cites research from, actually, this surprised me, Lisa Littman, who has documented the rise of transgender identification as this so-called social contagion. So in other words, there's epidemics of young women, in particular in the UK, who come out as trans. And the reason that surprised me, John, is because Littman has just been excoriated over the last, year or so since her study came out. as transphobic. So she suffered the same fate as Rowling has, and yet Rowling is still studying her work. This is something that we talked about on Breakpoint here. So it almost sounds like reading J.K. Rowling here, the arch Twitter liberal for years now, that she's on our side on this issue. It's a weird experience.
And even Harry Potter disassociated himself from
Daniel
the
Radcliffe,
woman who made him famous possible.
And Hermione. Emma Watson
Hermione
also
did too.
Condemned
well,
her.
Here's just one of the many, many, many inconsistencies of the whole transgender movement. I mean, we could start with the idea that feminism was built on men can't understand women's experience, and now in the transgender ideology, men can not only understand it, they can actually fully appropriate it. Not only that, but here you have Harry Potter telling J.K. Rowling what a woman actually can be. Isn't that called mansplaining?
I think it is.
Well, and when is it okay to mansplain? It's only okay to mansplain in this. Look, here's my prediction, and I know predictions, as Warren Cole Smith used to say, are dangerous, especially predictions about the future. But here's the issue that you have, is that these social movements, including the sexual revolution, others of the sexual revolution, have been driven by faulty ideology, faulty argumentation, and faulty science. But there's been at least an attempt to intellectually justify the positions of the L, of the G, of sexual liberation, of second wave feminism, and all that sort of stuff.
There's no attempt here. It's just a naked assertion that trans women are women.
The T has hooked its wagon and done none of the work. And I just don't think that it's going to sit well. Now, look, you and I could talk about, why male and female is not only biblically a reality, it's biologically a reality, it's genetically a reality, it's historically a reality, it's built into plants, it's built into animals, it's literally built into the fabric of reality itself, and we've done that before. Right. I think, though, this point is something to be watched because the feminist movement has had decades and decades of fighting for what they believe. And suddenly the T's are hopping on, trying to steal everything that they worked hard for without doing any of the work itself. And they do it in such a dramatic, melodramatic sort of way. This isn't going to go away. The L and the G do not get along with the T. And you have stuff like this. Really, J.K. Rowling is what's wrong with the world? That's what we're going to point to?
Yeah, this is very reminiscent of what we were talking about earlier with critical theory proponents turning on each other and the snake sort of eating its tail. J.K. Rowling is where, most progressives were just a few years ago. This is brand new. But, I'm kind of hopeful about this whole thing because she and so many other so-called trans exclusionary radical feminists, she's a big figure. She's someone who could potentially shift the narrative here. And it seems like, because she keeps coming back to this, that she's not afraid to actually take the heat and continue.
This is an important lesson, because how many people have we seen trip over themselves to apologize the moment they said something that was observably true but perceived to be, hateful or bigoted? And no one has yet said why what Harry Potter, sorry, I keep calling her Harry Potter. Why J.K. No one has ever said why what
At least call her McGonagall.
Yeah, right. Well, nobody has said why what she said is wrong or hateful or bigoted, just that it is. Yeah. And you know what this is going to demonstrate? Like Martina Navratilova, stick to your guns. Stick to your guns. And Christian, don't trip all over yourself. If we have folks that don't even have that power of the Holy Spirit or truth ultimately on their side, that have the courage to not say things that are observably absurd, don't say it yourself.
Yeah. This regime rests on fear. Every single person who doesn't capitulate reduces its power to intimidate the next person, to deplatform the next person. And that's why even, this sort of thing, it's interesting to watch. This is a really cool story to watch. In our second segment here, we want to roll right into a clip from one of our final Truth Love Together talks. This one was by Katie Faust, founder and director of the children's rights organization Them Before Us. Katie is going to talk about the significance of moms and dads, particularly fathers, in the formation of children and society. And as we come up on Father's Day here, it's a hugely relevant and vital topic for us to discuss. Here's Katie Faust.
Hey, Wilberforce Weekenders. I have a question for you. If you had the power to solve one of these devastating social issues, which would you choose? Youth suicide? Homelessness, behavioral disorders, poverty, rape, struggling students, addiction, high incarceration rates? Which one would you choose? I think it's pretty tough. You, like me, are probably deeply grieved about the prevalence of all these issues in the life of America today. But what if I told you there was an all-of-the-above option? What if you could do one thing and decimate every single issue we just listed? Well, there is. Take a look at this chart. In red, you're going to see the number of kids who grew up in fatherless homes that populate these social issues that we spend hundreds of millions of dollars to fight every year. 63% of kids who commit suicide are from fatherless homes. 90% of homeless youth are fatherless. 85% of all kids who show behavioral disorders. 47% of kids living in poverty. 80% of rapists with anger problems didn't have a dad. 71% of all high school dropouts, 75% of adolescent patients in chemical abuse centers, and 70% of youth in state-operated correctional institutions didn't have a dad in their life. The importance of a father's presence in a child's life is rivaled only by the importance of their mother's presence. I bet you can complete this sentence. Ideas have consequences. Bad ideas have victims. That's right. Now, there's a lot of bad ideas floating around out there when we talk about marriage and family. Here's a few of them. If the adults are happy, the kids will be happy. Kids don't need a mom and dad. They just need to be safe and loved. And biology doesn't matter. Love makes a family. You may have noticed, maybe not, but every conversation that we have about marriage and family and parenthood, they all have something in common. Whether it's the gossip about the latest celebrity divorce, or our national conversation about marriage policy, or court cases that have to do with two moms on a birth certificate. They all obsessively focus on what adults want. So much so that you might be tempted to think that if adults don't get the outcome they are looking for, that they're the victims. But they're not. When we get questions about marriage and parenthood wrong, the kids pay the price every time. I run a children's rights nonprofit called Them Before Us. Them, the kids, before us, the adults. We're committed to defending children's rights on this side of the womb. You're probably really familiar that children have a right to life. And thankfully, we have dozens of incredible organizations who are fighting to defend that right. But many of us haven't really thought about the fact that kids have a right on the other side of the womb as well. And beyond their right to life, the most important right is the right to be known and loved by the two people responsible for their existence. What do we know about the importance of this right? Well, we could look to international treaties. Check out the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the most widely ratified treaty in the world. Right after listing a child's right to be alive, they list a child's right to be known and loved by both parents. They should be protected. That relationship with their parents is something that should not be arbitrarily severed. They shouldn't be separated from their parents unless it's in the child's best interest. And if they are, they should be swiftly reunited. If that's not possible, the child should still have as much contact with their parents as possible. We could look at the experts and what the experts have to say about what this important right does to the well-being of children. Such as, if we were asked to design a system for making sure that children's basic needs were met, we would probably come up with something quite similar to the two-parent family ideal. Or we could listen to left-leaning child trends, which says, it's not simply the presence of two parents, but the presence of two biological parents that seems to support child development. Or collaborations that state, most scholars now agree that children raised by two biological parents in a stable marriage do better than children in other family forms across a wide range of outcomes. Now, if you don't trust the experts and you don't care about the UN, you can look to another source on the importance of this critical child right. You can look at your own life. Now, you probably fall into one of two groups. Either you grew up with a close, loving relationship with your mom and dad, and you enjoyed having your dad coach your t-ball team and your mom talking you through difficult situations at school. There's a good chance you still need them today. And I'd ask you, looking back at your own life, which one of those parents was optional for you? Which one could you have swapped out with no difference on your development and your identity? And the answer is neither. You needed both of them in distinct and complementary ways, and odds are you still do. Now, maybe you're in the other half of the population and you didn't have the relationship that you were made for. Maybe you lost a relationship with one or both of your parents to death, or divorce, or abandonment, or maybe you were created through sperm or egg donation and intentionally denied a relationship with one of those parents. And I'd ask you, did you love it? Would you encourage other people to recreate that childhood experience intentionally? Would you promote it? Would you think that government should incentivize it? The answer is no. Even if you got over it or figured it out like so many of you probably did, many of you would still say, it's one of the biggest wounds of my life. There's power to being connected to these two adults specifically. Social science tells us that statistically, these are the two adults who are the most protective of, connected to, and invested in kids. We know through the waves of adoptees and donor-conceived kids who are scouring the internet to find any information possible about their missing parents, that biological parents offer something that kids crave, and that's biological identity. And we know through mountains and decades of social science research that being raised by these two adults stacks the deck in favor of kids' healthy outcomes and spares them of all those issues that we listed at the beginning of this video. Now, motherlessness and fatherlessness, it's been around forever. We used to lose mothers regularly just through childbirth. We used to have generations of kids who would experience fatherlessness during times of war. Now, thankfully, modern medicine and modern warfare has drastically reduced the number of parents that have been lost to death. But mother loss and father loss is on the rise. But it's not because of tragedy. It's because of intentionality. These days, kids are losing their mother and father because adult desires are being prioritized above children's rights. And our courts and our laws are playing right along. You're at a worldview conference, right? I'm going to give you a little worldview pop quiz. Of the 5 major religions of the world, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, and Hinduism, what do they agree on? Do they agree on the nature of God? Do they agree on the nature of man? What about the problem in this world? Do they agree on the solution to the problem? Do they agree on the nature of the afterlife? Or do they agree on the definition of marriage? If you guessed the last one, you're smarter than most of politicians in our country. Throughout the world, cultures and religions have identified marriage as the union of a man and woman because it is the institution that unites the two people to whom children have a natural right. And it goes well for child, mother, father, and all of society when we encourage those norms of permanence, exclusivity, and monogamy.
And if you're listening on the podcast, you're catching an extended edition here where we're going to pick up just one more story that we weren't able to cover on radio because of time restrictions. And that is a story that's still developing even as we record. In the city of Birmingham, the Housing Authority, District Board of Commissioners, voted on Monday to end a partnership with one of the largest churches in America, certainly the largest church in Birmingham. It's called Church of the Highlands. And this is one of the most multi-ethnic, multicultural churches on the planet, much less in Birmingham. It has also done an amazing amount of good things. In fact, we talked about this church, Shane, in the early days of COVID and how quickly they were able to pivot and create a testing site for COVID-19 on their church property. They have a free health clinic that they offer to the whole community, and it's just a stunning work on so many different levels. You just made that connection
for me. I knew they sounded familiar, but I'd forgotten where I'd heard about them. That's the connection.
Yeah.
Wow, okay.
And for years, they've been renting space at local schools. And what happened, and this is what's interesting, what happened was an elementary teacher who doesn't go to that church tweeted out a concern that the pastor of that church, Chris Hodges, had liked, not even tweeted himself, but liked a handful of tweets by Charlie Kirk, who is a conservative activist, has critiqued the idea of systemic racism most recently. Mm-hmm. Now, I just want to be clear, Shane. I'm not sure what tweets he liked. I do know that when he was challenged about this, he spent this past weekend from the pulpit, and I've watched the service, weeping in front of his people, saying, I regret doing it because it's a distraction. I shouldn't have done it. I should have been more sensitive. And just being really clear that as much as, he may have agreed or disagreed with this or that or the other, that it just wasn't a priority because of the work that he has as a pastor of this church that does so much in the community across racial lines. If you look, for example, at the leadership of the church, it's a multi-ethnic, not only attendance, but leadership and so on. And even then, after spending Sunday doing that, the people in charge of allowing the schools to be rented out have basically said they're going to end the partnership. This church gives them tens of thousands of dollars a year. In their history, they've almost given the school board $1 million. And not to mention, everybody in the church is a taxpayer.
They're helping fund the school while it's empty on Sunday.
After paying taxes to fund the school.
Right.
And it wasn't a formal complaint. It was a Twitter post questioning. And in fact, she said, I'm not sure if he's a racist, but I wonder if he knows how tone deaf this is to like Charlie Kirk. Now, there are a lot of people that are good people that like Charlie Kirk. I haven't paid that much attention to Charlie Kirk. I don't know what I've seen. Some of it I like, some of it I disagree with. That's not the point. But it's not like Charlie Kirk's a white supremacist or a part of the KKK or anything like that, is he? Am I wrong on this? Is he?
I don't think so. I'm not super familiar with him.
Doesn't Candace Owens work with Charlie Kirk?
Yeah, I think so.
And I know, I know their views are not normal for, African, hers is not a typical dominant African-American view, but she's an African-American with that view. Is it a harmful view that she has? I just don't know. I might disagree.
It's just so ridiculous. It's just so, it's straining at gnats. And this sort of thing is close to my heart, John, because I spent 4 years at a church in Northern Virginia that met in a middle school. It had exactly the same arrangement as this church does. And this probably violates viewpoint discrimination and, equal use of public property and so forth. And who knows whether this sort of thing will stand. You can't just, you can't just go in and say, all right, we're not going to rent.
Use of school property has gone all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court has supported it. So,
right.
This has been pretty vetted out.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It seems like they're discriminating on the basis of viewpoint here. Mm-hmm. So, right. But, this is, I think, a illustration of something larger that's going on, John, that we're tearing apart as a society. We can't live together anymore. If we can't accommodate one another enough to even share the same building on different days of the week and take each other's rent money, what hope do we have? How can we possibly run a society together? We can't do it. Cancel culture tries to define views, and it's aggravating this because it tries to define views that most Americans held, yesterday, probably most Americans still hold in many cases, as outside of acceptable civilized conversation. This is just so beyond the pale that we can't even talk about it, hold these opinions, or even like the tweets of people who have these opinions. And in doing so, it's a recipe for continuing this rent in society.
So the Houston Authority of Birmingham District Board of Commissioners, man, that is a heck of a thing to make into an acronym. HABD, right? Here's their statement. Commissioners agreed that Pastor Hodges' views do not reflect those of HABD and its residents.
Why do they have to?
So they haven't since when? If you look at what he said on Sunday about race and about what happened to George Floyd and about the cause of Christians to do good in the world. Really, those aren't the views of HABD? The views that have turned facilities into a COVID-19 testing site in the middle of a pandemic for free? Are those not the views? I mean, literally, are we saying that the views are hitting like on tweets? I mean, is that really? We did it. Look, we did a breakpoint this past week that was called "Twitter's Not the Real World." It was another version of. We've kind of done this 2 or 3 times because Twitter can seem like the real world. I got out of last week feeling like Twitter was the real world. Right? It can just weigh on you. Are we really going to make a decision about tens of thousands of dollars and thousands of Birmingham residents and healthcare and the good of the local community based on that? This if this stands, this is a really frightening development, because you would be hard pressed to find a less controversial church in terms of the presence that they've had in the community than the Church of the Highlands. I mean, look, you can find, the Westboro Baptist Church and say, that's a really controversial church. And I would say it's not a church and it shouldn't be called that, right? Or you can go to even places that are, have even more kind of controversial figures as pastors, whether we're talking about First Baptist Dallas with Robert Jeffers or something like that, right? These are really Chris Hodges and Highlands doesn't fall into that category. And if this is coming after them, it's the if the last segment we talked about you can't be woke enough, this is you can't be nice enough. There's still this is a stunning thing, and we don't have all the details yet, but it's worth paying attention to.
Yeah, and I don't think that this is the pastor's intent, but we talked earlier about J.K. Rowling and cancel culture and so forth, and apologizing, capitulating to this sort of thing. It will add strength to it. It will increase the frequency that we'll see people just scanning Twitter feeds and looking for any excuse to shut someone down, to deplatform someone, to cancel someone. And in this case, the folks getting canceled are a church that's a pillar of the community
and doing remarkable good things. If they disappeared, Birmingham would be way worse off without them. Yeah.
That was Katie Faust, founder of Them Before Us. You can hear the rest of that talk by registering for all the content in our free online event, Truth, Love, Together. Just come to conference.colsoncenter.org to sign up and get this talk along with a ton of other great talks. John, there's a question we got this week that I really want to get to in our Q&A session here, and that is about the Black Lives Matter movement. The phrase, the movement, they're really tangled up together and difficult to kind of discern. So one of our listeners just wrote in, very simply, what is a Christian response to the Black Lives Matter movement? And so let's talk about that.
Again, another softball. Not at all. This is obviously a huge question. And this is a question, by the way, that we asked Chris Brooks and Andy Crouch in our conversation last week that was on the podcast. And if you go back in the podcast feed, you can listen to that. So let me say that one of the easiest things to do is to distinguish the phrase Black Lives Matter from the Black Lives Matter movement. And I know some people buck against even the saying. No, I say unequivocally Black Lives Matter. And I say it now because right now, in particular, friends and colleagues and human beings made in the image of God who are African American are suffering. If my wife came to me and said, "Do you love me?" and I said, "I love everyone," that doesn't quite get to the heart of what she's asking. And
the particularity is the point here.
Yeah, and that's why the All Lives Matter is just not helpful. In fact, one of the things I'm really thankful for, Shane, is the board of the Colson Center, and especially the leadership of our theology committee, has really pushed us in a direction to not let other people say things for us and to not embrace the way other people have said things as our own. Unless, of course, it's like the creeds, right, which are pretty stable. They're pretty solid, or Holy Scripture.
You can't let the Council of Nicaea speak for you, John. You have to come up with your own statement of belief.
Yeah, that's right. That one's okay. But this is why it's just really important to say every single human being is made in the image and likeness of God. And in cultural settings where particular image bearers are particularly vulnerable and are feeling particularly ostracized, demoralized, violated, those are the ones in particular that deserve our verbal affirmation and as much action as we can actually give. That's my unequivocal response to that. I have no problem saying Black Lives Matter. I want to say more than that. I don't want to just say that because it has become such a loaded phrase, and somebody else has coined that, and I don't want somebody else's meaning to be my meaning. That's what I mean. And I'm particularly certain that even if I don't agree with all the things being said right now about race, about the racial issue in America, about critical theory, as we talked about earlier in the program, about intersectionality and white privilege and all the other ways that this thing has been moved, I still am committed to seeing and listening and hearing individuals that are African American, particularly those who are of the household of faith, as Paul would say. And so that's what I mean when I say that. Let me also say this. The Black Lives Matter movement is a movement. I mean, it's an organization. Yeah. With an organization, it's got, a purpose statement and bylaws and a cause. And look, it has been just completely hijacked by ideology that's incompatible. And
it's a mess.
It is
Black
a mess.
Lives Matter as an organization is something that I would be very concerned if a Christian told me that they unequivocally supported that organization. They've got goals, that are incompatible with Christianity, as well as the goal of reducing racial injustice. And that's, they've openly promote abortion. The abolition of the family is one of the founding goals of the organization, that right there on their website. I mean, that's stuff we cannot affirm. So we need to affirm all truth, be precise, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And if that means that we carefully qualify what we mean when we say Black Lives Matter, that we're saying it in lowercase, not uppercase, so to speak, that we're not endorsing the organization, then that's a distinction that we have to make. And maybe there's another phrase we could use to communicate the same truth without implying that we're for everything the organization is for. But, that's an important distinction that we need to make.
Can I make one more distinction too? And then we get to wrap this up. But let me make one more distinction that I think is really important. And that is that too many, I think, Christians are spending their time responding solely to the Black Lives Matter movement without responding to the image bearers, that are of the household of faith, who are telling us things that we need to hear, even if we don't fully agree with all the other narratives that are about it. And I think that that's really one of the issues we got to deal with. I don't want the fact that I disagree with the Black Lives Matter, capital letters movement, to be the focus of my attention right now, because the answer is not me saying why that's wrong. I might have to say that, and when I do have to say it, I will say it. But the right answer is saying, well, what can I actually do right now as Christians? What solution do I have? In other words, I think too many Christians think it's a solution to condemn the movement because it's misguided. It is misguided. But what's the solution? What do we have that we can contribute? And again, I go back to a commentary that got me in more trouble last week than any of the others, which is saying a lot, because they all did, but this one especially, is that inside the Bible is literally the only thing in history that has ever given a stable grounding of common humanity and has ever addressed the divides of humanity, including the racial divide. And the only thing that's ever ultimately inspired anything that's ever worked, even though nothing's ever worked completely, and we're never going to be outside the fall, so we're going to deal with this in many ways. The only source that's ever solved the problem is what we have in our hands. And if we spend all of our time saying, this is why BLM is wrong, as opposed to this is what the Bible says about everyone, and here's how we can actually move forward, and here's how the Bible talks about family, and how the Bible talks about government, and how the Bible talks about church, and how the Bible talks about human dignity and human value, and here's how we can build on that, like our forebears did in so many different contexts, we're going to be missing a huge opportunity. So that's how I'd answer that.
So John Stonestreet endorses Black Lives Matter. I'm going to go on your Twitter. I'm going to deplatform you. I'm going to send screenshots to everyone, whoever has your loan for your house. I'm just going to try to destroy your life because of this, John.
Well, look, who knows what can happen. But if you could deplatform me on Twitter, I would count it as a blessing.
And that's why I spend very little time on Twitter. Well, that's all we can get to today, folks. Head over to breakpoint.org for links to all of the stories and articles and videos and podcasts we mentioned on today's program. You'll also find new material every day to help you think and live Christianly. And we're glad that you're listening. For the Colson Center and for John Stonestreet, I'm Shane Morris. We'll see you next time.